the Great St. Lawrence, which is just this fantastic over 1,900-mile course up into the Great Lakes. That's almost 3,000 kilometers or so, and then its headwaters are actually at the Seven Beaver Lake in the Mesabi Range in Minnesota near Hibbing. But of course, the United States and Canadian border, they are the world's longest unguarded border in the world. And as I thought about my study of Canadian history, it was something I was never taught in school in the U.S. And it's sort of a amnesia for Americans not to know enough about Canada, especially the details of the history, which I'll give some of, and my Canadian friends can correct me on various things, I'm sure, after I'm done. But of course, this vast country has the world's longest coastline, of which we are seeing just a bit of it. And this space view of the Great St. Lawrence, Nova Scotia there to the left, and Newfoundland covered typically with clouds, and then the entrance into where we are headed. Now, Quebec itself is a vast province. It's actually larger than France. And of course, once you get out of the river valley, it quickly becomes mountains, and then tundra, and then Arctic conditions. But this is a vast area with plenty of water resources, especially. See all these different lakes and rivers. And so much of the water that comes into the St. Lawrence comes from the uplands, the Laurentians and the Canadian Shield, the great rocky northern part of Quebec, Canada, that had been scraped by glaciers back in the good old days. But now it comes and narrows near a couple of these rivers. It has about a 16,000 cubic meter flow at the Saguenay River that comes in the last major tributary of the St. Lawrence. And then after that, it is tidal with a lot of wash and currents from the ocean, which gives it a very rich ecology and was traditionally very productive as a fishery and used to be full of whales. Now, you might see a few out as you watch on deck, but essentially they have been decimated in a way, and there are only a few remnant populations that come up here to feed on their way even further north. Now, the area that we're going in, of course, we came from Cape Breton, around there yesterday in the evening, and then now we're up off of Anticosti Island and coming into the real river where we see both banks. This is a flooded continental shelf, and as I described yesterday, the seas have been rising for millions of years, and they have covered over the continental shelves of most of the continents, leaving this trace canyon. That is the St. Lawrence River at its mouth, now hundreds of miles offshore. But what this produced for this region is the Great Banks, the Grand Bank south of Newfoundland, George's Bank, the various other Flemish Cap, and these were the traditional, very abundant fishing grounds, which are now sadly depleted. And a lot of this fecundity of the marine life comes from the collision of the currents, as I described yesterday. The Labrador current comes down from the Greenland regions down the coast of Labrador, around into the Grand Banks, where it meets the warm waters of the Gulf Stream, and that creates a lot of upwelling of minerals and a lot of fervent marine life in that region. And it's very, very shallow. So even though it looks like we're in a very broad bay, the shipping channels are very carefully marked so that we stay off the shelving regions as we go up the river. So right now we're in the Laurentian Channel, coming up the Honguedo, named after a Spanish explorer, into the river itself up to Quebec. But you can see the topology is very rugged just upriver. Both Newfoundland over here, the high mountains there, the Gaspé, which is the last extension of the Appalachian Mountains that come all the way up the eastern seaboard, and then these are the Laurentians all over the north bank of the St. Lawrence. In tidal studies and hydrography, the curiosity of this bay is that it gets swirling, varied tides in various places. So what is true up the river is quite different down in towards Prince Edward Island or up onto the shores of Newfoundland. So this is just a graphic of how the tides come in and they turn around and then they go upriver, come back down. And so it's quite complicated. And of course, this was important when you were in a sail ship. We just go steam willy-nilly through it now. It also has very great depths, with very cold water on the basins and in the deep channels, and then warmer water, of course, on the surface. So this river is falling from the Great Lakes. It actually comes out very cold, warms up in the bay, and then by the time it reaches the ocean, it's all mixed with salt water, and there it goes into the greater sea. For the first of the Europeans who came here were probably Norse. but I'll talk about that another day. And there are Norse settlements in Newfoundland and perhaps even up the St. Lawrence, and some would surmise they even went all the way up into the lakes and disappeared in the great inland waterways. But the first recorded sighting of this great bay was from John Cabot, but he was a Venetian named Giuseppe Caboto. If you were in Halifax on the water walk yesterday, you may have seen a monument dedicated from the city of Venice to his discovery. He was employed by merchants in Bristol and sailed out in the Matthew in 1496, got over here 1497. So he was right on the heels of Columbus, but he took the northern route, probably because they knew that there was fishing up here. There had probably been Basque or Portuguese fishermen that had been out here before, either got lost and came back, said there are places where there's great resources out there. So he went off to find the Newfoundland, as he literally called it, which became the island of Newfoundland. The course that he took is not really known. These are actually two different marine historians' view of the course. His first trip over landed, came off Cape Breton and described the Great Bay, and this obviously was some sort of internal river. He thought this was, of course, the route to Asia, just like all the other explorers were searching at the time. He went back to Bristol after planting an English flag. Now, this is not an actual photograph from 14. But once again, you have to bear with me in the entertainment of it all. But here's a period illustration. He became suddenly the cause célèbre, and the royal house of Henry the Seventh, I believe it was sent him back with more ships. But on that voyage, he disappeared, and he never was found again. He probably got caught in some storm or hit some rocks, and it's very treacherous coming in around all of these places, you can imagine, if you didn't know where you were going. But this is a view of his send-off with the beginning the blessings of the king and the royal banner and such, and the church. So this is still the pride of Bristol, that their great explorer, at least he came back to tell about it once. But when the area was better known, there came the world to come fishing, especially, again, Portuguese, Basque, Spanish, English, French. They all came to the Grand Banks to collect the great harvest of cod. They said you could just drop a basket in the sea and pull them up, and you could fill your ship and go back. And of course, I told you yesterday, that whole fishery has now been closed because it has been just so overfished that there's not enough to preserve the remnant stock. And they say it will only take about 500 years before it builds up again. So enjoy your salt cod while you have it. Well, this was the impetus for people to actually settle, especially in Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, on the shores of the St. Lawrence. And of course, there were other people already there. This is an illustration of the Beothuk, who were the native people on Newfoundland. And they also fished, and they were originally friendly with these curious people coming across the sea, but there was a dispute over furs or fishing rights, and they were then hunted. And they were the first Native American nation to be exterminated. And so this is the ghosts that inhabit the far coast. Well, then came Jacques Cartier in 1535, and he was a well-organized explorer with a number of ships, and he came all the way up to what is now Quebec. And he drew these original charts of the region. Now, he named the area Canada, which is an Algonquin Iroquois word for the riverbank, and that's how the name became that of the entire nation. But of course, this is not what they call, this is a south-up map, so the north is actually up on the bottom of this illustration. But he came in all his regalia, and he set up a small encampment at what is now Quebec. The name Quebec means, in, again, Algonquin, where the river narrows. And as you see when we go up there, the ship can't get much farther just because of the channel pinches quite a bit, and the ship is too big to get all the way up into the other parts of St. Lawrence. But this is one of Cartier's early charts of the region. And you can see it's not geographically correct because they really didn't even know the extent of the eastern seaboard. And so, but it was a great news in France that there was a whole nother territory that nobody had gotten to. And they, of course, were in competition with the Spanish in the south and the English in the mid-coasts. And so it was left to Samuel de Champlain, who came and founded Quebec as we know it today in 1608. Now again, they were coming to a territory that was very well populated with estimated 50,000 different natives in the Iroquois and also the Huron and other nations further inland who were competitive amongst themselves, and then they competed for the goods that the Europeans were bringing, whether it be metal, textiles, or other trinkets they would trade. And so the history of Canada, like much of the Americas, is the competition between the natives to get the favor or to oppose the invaders from the other side of the ocean. Well, these are sort of colorful illustrations later of Champlain and other explorers going up into the inlands and making treaties, but the whole history of the settlement of Canada has never been quite as easy as anybody thought it should be, of course. So that as the French came up and they began to explore the rivers, they found the rapids up above Montreal, and then they started to hear about these vast inland sea, which we know today as the Great Lakes. But Quebec was the only town at the time, and it remains to this day as the oldest city in North America from 1608. It was a very small place with only about 500 people in it, 1/4 of whom were Catholic clerics because they were sent to missionize. And so the penetration of the countryside was often done by Jesuits, who were the ones who were brave and courageous enough to go all the way in to keep finding. And of course, the story of New France meant that they went all the way to Lake Michigan, and then they went down the Chicago River and others down to the Mississippi, and then ended up having the other settlement was New Orleans. So the French Empire in America was much larger than the English for many, many years until things changed. The French also built these great fortresses. This is the one, Louisbourg, which is on Cape Breton Island, and unfortunately we did not have the schedule to stop there. We have to stop at Sydney on the very northern tip of Cape Breton Island, and then travel over to the site on the ocean where this tremendous big fort was built, and it remains to this day. The British seized it or rather laid siege in 1758, and because they had no food supplies in the fort, there was no farmland around, all the provisions had to be brought by sea, it was finally surrendered by the French commander and then became a ruin for many centuries. And then in the 1940s, they began to rebuild it as a historic site. And now if you go, you'll have the pleasure of all of the fine comforts of a 18th century fortress with the sewers in the street and the rough cabins and, of course, the rough French soldiers who are all reenactors. But it's actually very dramatic. I've been there a couple times, and it's probably the only fortress that really puts on a good show that I found, and it's a national park of Canada. They have the accommodations, and you can actually go in there and have the bread and the very cheap wine that they used to drink then. And then as the French continued up the rivers, they built more stockades, and even villages that were friendly to the French would be surrounded by a palisade of these kind of wooden walls just to prevent other natives from attacking, or else the enemy being the English usually. And the culture of the native First Nations, as they're called in Canada, is still alive, and this is an illustration of the early game of lacrosse. It was the French name in Algonquin or Iroquois was called bagatawe, but it was played as a surrogate to armed warfare, and sometimes they have 1,000 players over a vast field of many kilometers long, and they would run around and hit each other and call it a day. But that was back before there was much to fight over. When the French and English came in and had all these goods, just like in Mexico, all mayhem broke loose out of the jealousies and the angers and the disputes. This is a Huron group that is taking it's a burial site in Ontario where they would, every 12 years, all the villages would bring their deceased from their above ground placement and then lay them in a fur-lined pit to go join the Great Spirit. And this was written about by the Jesuits as a curious custom, but of course it was considered idolatry and savage activity. And then the natives slowly were converted to Christianity. But meanwhile, there was a lot of fighting between the Iroquois, the Huron, with the French sided with the Iroquois. I'm sorry, with the Huron, and then the English were siding with the other groups, the Seneca, And the tales of the Indian Wars, or the French and the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian Wars, it's referred to in English at least, was a bloody mess for many, many years and decimated many of the native peoples, along with disease, which reduced their population to a fraction of what they had been before. This illustration is of the savage practice of scalping, because they would put a bounty, pay a scalp, both French and English did, but it was actually invented by the Dutch governor of New Amsterdam, who had that as the price for the wars that went up the Hudson Valley. So it was actually a European imposition upon the natives, and then it was done gleefully because they get paid for every piece of hair they could get. Well, here's the Jesuits, who are becoming martyrs at a certain point, going bravely to their death, and a number of them have become saints, including some of the native convertees also have become saints in the Catholic Church for resisting the unbelievers that were often brutal. But eventually, as I said, most of the natives became converted, and you have this illustration, which is Huron, of the baby Jesus who's wrapped in rabbit clothes in a nice, comfortable teepee. And so the nature of the religion became more native. Then the French continued up all these vast river into the interior in what they call the voyageurs. They're basically looking for fur, and that was the great commodity to send back to Europe. So these voyageurs would go out in the winter in the snow, in snowshoes, again, a native invention. And often the French would then intermarry with the local natives, and they became what they call the métis, or the mixed breed that lived in the interior. And they were a very vibrant group, speaking French usually, but they've often resisted any other governmental control, and they had their own rebellions. And the central provinces of Canada, Saskatchewan in particular, were founded by refugee métis who didn't want to be under the rule of either the English, especially after the war that conquered Quebec. Now, this city is essentially built on a big rock over the river. It's called Cap Diamant, which overlooks and has a strategic position for the citadel, which can control the river traffic. So this became the capital for all of New France, and then built beautiful cathedrals and fortresses and things we can see when we visit there. We will land right on the shore where the original town was, and has many of the buildings have been restored, and they've made a historic monument of the Place Royale right there in the center with the oldest church in all of Quebec. But then came the British Navy and Army, led by the great General James Wolfe. And on September 13th, 1759, they managed to get up in the Narrows, critically led by a young Lieutenant James Cook, who was a master cartographer, took out longboats, sounded the river, and found landing places which were not guarded by the French troops. And then they came up behind the Plains of Abraham, it's called, and then came up behind the city, and then they had a standing fusillage and battle right there on the plains. Curiously, both General Wolfe and the French leader Montcalm were both mortally wounded in the battle, but it was decisively a British victory. And then the British laid siege for another year on the citadel and the fortress of the wall city. And it was so bitterly cold, supposedly the Catholic nuns knitted woolens to give to the British troops so they wouldn't freeze to death and stop the siege, I guess. But it was a very poignant conflict, which then led to, of course, New France becoming part of the British Empire. Now, these two great generals, felt that they were off at the ends of the world, and General Wolfe was quoted to say, "My troops are all rascals and disobedient." Of course, a lot of them were forced into service. And Marquis de Montcalm, he said of Canada that it's a wild place where the dishonest get rich and the honest are put aside. So neither of them had a great opinion of what they had actually conquered. But then as they both died at the battle, they became somewhat immortals, and they have a monument in the Governor's Garden together. And their monument reads, "A common death, history a common fate, and posteriority a common monument." meaning the nation of Canada still is unified after this battle, and of course it's been a difficult engagement ever since, but especially when the British authorities forced the French residents out of Nova Scotia and what is near Prince Edward Island and all these communities that had been settled by the French at the mouth of the St. Lawrence. They were called the Acadians, and they were driven out. And so they were sent to wherever they could get to. They were often refused in the English colonies. They had to go all the way down to New Orleans, which is why there's Cajun culture, French speakers in New Orleans and Louisiana. And most famously, the great poem of Evangeline, the young woman who was so desperately cast out of her home and sent off, is the great Longfellow poem. Now, there in Halifax, there's a monument to this. I don't know if you saw this again down the waterway. I just took this picture the other day of the immigration and then the expulsion, what they call the grand dérangement, or the upheaval, sending all of these tens of thousands of French people out of the area. Now, there were so many in Quebec and in the uplands of the river, they did not expel them. The British thought that the ones on the outer sea would be much more trouble if there was a rebellion. Meanwhile, the town of Quebec grew and became prosperous, particularly with fur trade, timber trade, agricultural activities. And so the Quebecois, they will call themselves, are very resilient people living in very tough climate. And back in the countryside in reaches of Quebec, they still speak a French that is very different than the modern French in France, so that it's very clipped, and like some parts of the Appalachian Mountains, you get Scottish or English that is actually an antique version because of the isolation. But living in this climate was not very easy. And when the French were in control, it was sort of a feudal society where, even though they were technically freemen by the time they came over to settle, the seigneur of the area would lay out these striped farm plots to give her. This is on Anacostia Island, that part. And then you see that design has continued on to this day, where the housing is down on the river for commerce and for trade, but all of the upland becomes various crops until you get up into the woods, and then you have woodland for a woodlot. And so this goes on to the day. If you're flying over this part, you'll see the farmland is in a sort of this strip formation. That is an inheritance from the original settlements of the French. And you see this as we go in a little closer to the river. You see these farms that are just straight up the hill, and then they're side by side. They all have an access on the river so that they can have their private yacht right in front. And remnant of this are all these beautiful stone silos and many historic monuments, little quaint French-style towns, even though it's not completely France. It looks very much like it in many ways. And the Quebecois were always angry that they lost that battle. And there have been rebellions in various parts ever since. This is the 1827 rebellion, where they called the Filles de Laval, had formed a French Quebecois militia and had running battles with the authorities for a number of years until it was again suppressed. And now it's all peaceful, more or less, and the city has grown now. Quebec itself has about 700,000 residents. All of Quebec province has about 8 million residents. So there's a vast land with not so many people, and most of them are concentrated right along the river. And you'll see Quebec sort of sprawls out with industrial and suburbs and things, but the citadel and the Cap Diamant, heart of the city, the Quebec, is very much almost a medieval remnant of another era. And we'll dock right there where that ship is, and we can walk right into the Place Royale, and then you can climb up into the heights. Now they have funicular, or you can take the stairway. It's about 31 floors, about 700 feet over the river, though, and they call that staircase, particularly when it's icy in the winter, the casse-cou, or break your bottom if you fall. So watch your step. But we're here just ahead of the fun time, which is the winter. And I was once in Quebec, and when it first snowed and first got icy, and then they said, oh, now we can have fun. Because traditionally in this part of Canada, it's so luscious in the summer, then it's so bitter cold in the winter that they said you had to work all summer growing food, traveling, doing your trade. But as soon as the winter stopped all transport, everybody stayed indoors and started to sing and dance and have fun. And now, of course, they're all playing hockey, and they're still working. But it used to be that there was an old saying, Quebecois, when the winter begins, the fun begins. So this is right there in the old town, right where we'll dock. You can walk in there and see that what are now become restored buildings and shops and such. And above is the great Chateau Frontenac, which is not really an antique. It was built in the 1920s by Canadian Pacific Railroad as one of their many fantastic hotels that would link across Canada all the way Alberta, BC, all the way to Vancouver. And so this became an icon of the city, though it's not really an antique chateau. It's sort of French on supersized. But it is still a hotel and offices and quite a beautiful construction. Go in, and inside is quite elegant. Right next to it is the Citadelle, which is the old fortress, which is still a Canadian military site. British troops were stationed there until 1871, and when the Dominion was formed, now it's the Canadian military there. This is the Plains of Abraham and the Terrasse du Pharaon, which overlooks the river. And so this is a good hike just around the whole area. And the battle was right on that site, so now it's a war memorial. Here's a map. You see Vieux-Quebec, and then the Hauteville, which extends down roads on the cliffside. And then there's the rest of the city, which is not vast, but it's goes out into the broad suburbs. And they said that you had palaces on the river, but then you had rough shacks in the farms just as soon as you got out of the city, the capital city. And for many years, this was a great timbering area, also paper production, many things. So Quebec, its largest export for many decades was logs and timber, mainly to send to Europe. So there's none of that there now. This kind of floating raft trade is now replaced by other means. And again, in the winter, the river will freeze up, so it stops most of the transit unless the channel's broken through by icebreakers for the sea trade, which I'll get to. Then further upriver, this is right at the Richelieu River, which is on the south bank of the St. Lawrence, which then is an access to Lake Champlain and the Hudson River Valley. So this was fortified. That's another French fort that was built about 1701 right there to guard the Richelieu River. And it had its moments in military history to be guarded by French and then British, and then during the American Revolution and the War of 1812, this was a strategic stronghold. Now, you may remember that there was this cousinly dispute called the American Revolution, and the Loyalists essentially were driven out of their states and colonies and came to found what was then called Lower Canada, which was essentially Ontario. And so these were the Loyalist colonists arriving in port to go to a new home. And most famously, one of them was Samuel Cunard, the founder of this line, who was originally a German from Pennsylvania. And then he ended up in Lower Canada, then moved to Nova Scotia and began his brilliant career. Well, this pesky history between the colonies, again, this is not known by many mere Americans, that during the War of 1812, American troops leaving from Massachusetts tried to conquer Quebec and Montreal, and they were driven back at the Battle of Chateauguay in Quebec, which is near Montreal, and that stopped the, let's say, the submission of Canada provinces to the United States. And of course, in a return favor, the British Royal Navy came and burnt Washington, D.C. But that's just a minor dispute. And so then Montreal became the leading city. Now that's further upriver. We don't get to go up there. But of course, it started out as a fur trading point. It was founded by Samuel de Champlain. And then it has this mountain right above it. You see, that's the Royal Mountain. He came up the river. He said, well, that's a good place for a town and a fortress. And so that's where Montreal was established, and now it's a major city, beautiful city, with a historic center, again, right downtown on the riverfront. That's the cathedral there with the dome. And it is a charming town. If you haven't been there, we don't get to go there this trip. But it has its old quarters and charms, and but it's very vibrant and leading Canadian industry. And the Quebecois have become an urbanized, very well-educated, technologically adept population. And the youth are proud to be Quebecois and also Canadian. But this dispute over the independence of Quebec has been going on for decades and generations now. And after some incidents back in the 70s, the final referendum was no, we are not going to separate from Canada, because if the Quebecois separate, then the native peoples, the Cree and others, they said they'd announce their independence and the whole federation would